There is a door in downtown Chicago that opens 12 feet below street level. Not a maintenance hatch, not a sewer access panel. A door, with a transom window above it, framed in decorative ironwork, hinged to open inward, exactly the way you would hang a door if you expected someone to walk through it from the street. Except the street it once faced is now buried under more than a decade of compacted fill, cobblestone, and the accumulated weight of a city that quietly raised itself and never told anyone why. I found a photograph of it in 2021 in a physical archive in Springfield, Illinois, while I was looking for something else entirely. A survey photograph, undated, but cataloged alongside materials from the 1870s. And I remember sitting there with that photograph in my hands thinking, not what is this, but how many more are there? That is the question I have been unable to stop asking for the past 3 years, because Chicago is not the only city with a buried floor. Boston raised its downtown by as much as 10 feet in the 19th century. Lower Manhattan has a shoreline that moved steadily outward for 200 years, each generation of landfill burying the evidence of the generation before it. London sits on top of 23 rivers, the Fleet, the Walbrook, the Effra, that were not always underground. They were covered, deliberately, within institutional memory, within the lifespan of people who watched it happen, and wrote letters about it, and then died, and were forgotten. I want to be very clear about what I am and am not saying here. I am not saying that there was a single lost civilization erased by a coordinated global effort. That kind of claim requires a kind of certainty I do not have, and I have learned, slowly, painfully, to distrust certainty in this line of work. What I am saying is something more specific and more verifiable, that in city after city, on multiple continents, within roughly the same 50-year window of the mid to late 19th century, a systematic effort was made to elevate, bury, or fundamentally restructure the built environment, and that the official explanations for why this happened are, in several cases, arithmetically impossible. Let me show you what I mean. In 1856, the city of Chicago commissioned an engineering project that had no real precedent in American history. The problem officially was drainage. Chicago had been built on a swamp, and its streets flooded constantly, and the stagnant water was breeding cholera and typhoid, and people were dying. All of that is true. The solution the city chose was to raise the entire street level of downtown Chicago by as much as 14 feet in some areas, to physically lift the grade of the city above its own foundation, fill in the space below, and simply pretend the old ground floor had never existed. The engineering feat was genuine. George Pullman, yes, the same Pullman who later built the sleeping cars, made part of his early fortune operating the hydraulic jacks used to lift entire city blocks. Contemporary newspapers described the process in almost celebratory terms. Buildings were raised while people continued to live and work in them. Storefronts were elevated while customers kept shopping. It was presented as a marvel, a triumph of American ingenuity over geography. What the newspapers did not dwell on was what was left below. The excavation surveys conducted between 1857 and 1871, the year of the Great Fire, recorded in dry bureaucratic language the removal and disposal of what the surveyors called prior structural elements inconsistent with the original survey plat. That phrase appears 11 times in the Consolidated Drainage Report filed with the Illinois State Legislature in 1868, 11 times. And not once does the report explain what those structural elements were, where they came from, or where they went. I found the report in the Illinois State Archives. It is publicly available. You can request it yourself. The drainage project cost the city $397,000 in documented expenditures, but the contract records filed separately with the city comptroller show total payments to excavation contractors of $1.2 million over the same period, for a project that, by the official account, involved raising structures upward, not digging downward. The gap is not a rounding error. The gap is $800,000 in $1860, which is approximately $28 million today, paid to men who were removing something from the ground beneath Chicago that the official record never names. I want to be honest with you about the limits of what that gap proves. It proves that money was spent on something that wasn't accounted for in the public-facing reports. It does not prove what that something was. It could be graft. It could be accounting errors. It could be that the cost overruns were simply absorbed into vague line items the way government expenditures often are. I genuinely cannot tell you with certainty which of those explanations is correct. What I can tell you is that when I started looking for similar patterns in other cities, I found them. In Boston, the filling of the Back Bay neighborhood between 1857 and 1882 is one of the most well-documented urban engineering projects in American history. Gravel trains ran around the clock from Needham, Massachusetts, depositing fill at a rate of 2,000 carloads per day at peak operation. The project converted tidal wetlands into what is now one of the most expensive real estate districts in New England. The official history of the project describes it as a public health initiative and a land speculation venture, and both of those things are true. What is less discussed is what the surveyors found when they drove the first pilings into the tidal flats in the late 1850s. There is a report in the collection of the Massachusetts Historical Society, available to researchers by appointment, digitized in part on their website, filed by a civil engineer named Thaddeus Breckinridge in November of 1858. Breckinridge was contracted by the Commonwealth to assess subsurface conditions before the major filling operations began. His report runs to 41 pages. The first 37 pages are standard soil composition analysis. The last 4 pages, which are written in a noticeably different hand, suggesting they were added later, describe the discovery of what Breckinridge calls dressed stone foundations of considerable extent, inconsistent with any known colonial or pre-colonial construction method. Dressed stone, not rough-cut field stone, which is what colonial-era Boston foundations look like. Dressed stone, quarried, shaped, fitted, in the tidal flats, below the colonial waterline. Breckinridge's report was filed and, as far as I can determine, never formally acknowledged by the Commonwealth. The Back Bay filling project proceeded on schedule. By 1882, the dressed stone foundations were under 8 feet of gravel and another 40 years of urban development. I don't know what those foundations were. I want to say that plainly. I have read Breckinridge's report twice, and I have looked for any follow-up survey, any secondary reference, any mention of the discovery in the correspondence of other engineers working on the project at the same time, and I have found nothing, which is itself a kind of answer, even if it's not the one I was looking for. There is a woman I keep coming back to when I think about what it meant to live through this period. Her name was Harriet Elmira Foss. She was born in 1831 in a small town on the Connecticut coast, the daughter of a harbor pilot who spent 40 years reading the shoreline the way other men read books. Every depth, every current, every rock formation memorized because lives depended on it. Harriet grew up watching her father draw maps of the harbor from memory, correcting the published charts when they were wrong, which was often. She moved to Boston in 1854 as a young widow with 2 children, and found work as a copyist for a firm of civil engineers on Tremont Street. She was, by the account of her employer, preserved in a letter held at the Boston Athenaeum, exceptionally precise. She notices discrepancies, he wrote, in what reads as both admiration and mild unease, that most men would not think to look for. In 1859, her firm was subcontracted to assist with the Back Bay surveys. She was not a licensed engineer. Women could not be licensed engineers, but she did the same work as the junior men around her, at a fraction of the pay, under her employer's signature. She was present for at least 3 of the survey sessions in the tidal flats during the period when Breckinridge was conducting his subsurface assessments. She left no memoir. She left no published account. What she left was a series of letters to her sister in New London, Connecticut, spanning the years 1854 to 1871, which were donated to the Connecticut Historical Society by a great-granddaughter in 1962, and have been available to researchers since then. In a letter dated February of 1860, she writes, "I have been forbidden to speak of what we found in the mud last Thursday, and Mr. H. has made clear that my continued employment depends upon my discretion. I will say only that I understand now why Father always told me the charts were wrong. Some things are removed from the charts not because they were never there, but because someone decided they should not be." She never names what was found. She never elaborates. She died in 1891, having outlived both of her children and her employer. Her letters were bundled and stored and forgotten for 70 years, and whatever she saw in the mud of the Back Bay in January or February of 1860, she took it with her. Imagine the kind of person who did the actual work, not Breckinridge. not the politicians who approved the filling contracts. The men, and they were almost all men, who stood in the freezing tidal mud with hand tools and made the first cuts into the sediment. Irish immigrants, mostly, fleeing the aftermath of the famine. Men whose names do not appear in any survey report, whose deaths would not have been recorded if they happened on the job, whose understanding of what they were excavating came entirely from what they could see with their own eyes. There had to be a moment, there had to be, when one of them stopped and looked at what his shovel had uncovered and said something to the man next to him, in Irish probably, a word or a sentence that named what they were seeing, and the man next to him would have looked and looked away and gone back to work, because the alternative to going back to work was not eating that week. That moment happened. I am as certain of that as I am of anything in this investigation, and it left no record. The pattern I keep finding is not a pattern of dramatic suppression. It is a pattern of systematic inattention, which is a different thing, and in some ways more difficult to argue against. Dramatic suppression leaves evidence. Orders given, records destroyed, people silenced. Inattention leaves nothing. It operates by simply not asking certain questions, not following certain threads, not funding certain kinds of excavation. Consider what we know about the ground beneath London. The Walbrook River, one of the 23 buried rivers of London, ran through the center of the Roman city of Londinium and was progressively built over between the medieval period and the 18th century. The Museum of London has Roman artifacts pulled from its former course. This is acknowledged, documented, unremarkable to most Londoners. What is less discussed is the material recovered during the construction of the Victoria Embankment in the 1860s, a project almost exactly contemporary with the Chicago raising and the Boston Back Bay filling. The embankment construction, which ran from 1864 to 1870 under the direction of engineer Joseph Bazalgette, required driving massive foundations into the Thames riverbed and reclaiming approximately 52 acres of tidal foreshore. The project is celebrated, correctly, as one of the engineering triumphs of the Victorian era, and Bazalgette is celebrated, correctly, as one of the great civil engineers in history. His work transformed London's sewer system and effectively ended the recurring cholera epidemics that had killed tens of thousands. But the excavation logs from the embankment project, held in the London Metropolitan Archives, contain entries that have never made it into any popular account of Bazalgette's work. Entries describing, in the terse language of Victorian engineering reports, the removal of what are catalogued as anomalous subgrade formations, origin undetermined, inconsistent with riverine deposition. These entries appear across multiple sections of the embankment work, from Blackfriars to Chelsea. They appear in 1865, 1866, and 1867. And then, in 1868, they stop appearing entirely. Not because the excavation was complete, but because a new cataloging system was introduced that year that, as best I can determine, simply did not include a category for what had previously been described as anomalous. 3 cities, 3 separate projects, 3 separate national bureaucracies, all within the same decade, all producing, in their official records, the same category of unexplained expenditure, the same cursory references to subsurface material that doesn't fit the expected geology, and the same subsequent administrative decision to either stop noting it or stop funding the kind of excavation that would encounter it. I am not saying this was coordinated. I want to be precise about that. Coordination would require evidence of communication, of shared intent, and I do not have that evidence. What I am saying is that the coincidence is statistically improbable enough that it requires some explanation, and I have not been able to find one that satisfies me. The question I have been asked most often when I talk about this material is, why would anyone want to hide this? And I always have to stop and explain that I think that question gets the logic backwards. You don't have to posit a reason to hide something in order to explain why something gets hidden. Institutions hide things constantly, for reasons that have nothing to do with the thing itself, because acknowledging an anomaly would complicate a contract, because explaining a discrepancy would require explaining why the original survey was wrong, because the men responsible for a project had political enemies who would use any admission of uncertainty as a weapon. The history of public works is full of information that got buried not because it was dangerous, but because it was inconvenient. But there is a second explanation that I find myself returning to, and it is less comfortable. The mid-19th century was the period in which the modern discipline of archaeology was being formalized, when the first professional excavation standards were being written, when the first university chairs in prehistoric studies were being established, when the first serious attempts were being made to create a systematic account of human history on this continent and others. It was also, not coincidentally, a period of intense political anxiety about that history, about who had been here first, about what claims to the land could be made on the basis of prior occupation, about what a more complex and layered story of human presence in the Americas would mean for the political settlements that had been reached through violence within living memory. I am not saying that the men who supervised the Chicago raising, or the Boston filling, or the London embankment construction were consciously aware of these political implications. Most of them were engineers focused on drainage coefficients and contractor invoices, but the institutions that employed them, the city governments, the state legislatures, the parliamentary committees, were absolutely aware of the political valence of questions about prior occupation and prior structures, and those institutions had every incentive to create administrative frameworks in which anomalous findings simply did not need to be addressed, because they had never been officially noticed. The last thing I want to show you is a number. In 1871, the year of the Chicago fire, the city commissioned a comprehensive survey of the ground beneath the downtown core. The fire had destroyed approximately 17,000 buildings and left the city with a rare opportunity. For the first time since the raising project of the 1850s and 60s, large sections of the urban core were cleared to bare ground, and the subsurface was accessible in a way it had not been for 15 years. The survey was completed in 1872. It runs to 340 pages and is held in the Chicago History Museum's Research Center. I have read all 340 pages. The survey documents, with great precision, the locations of 847 distinct structural foundations identified in the post-fire excavations. Of these 847 foundations, 791 are accounted for by reference to pre-fire building records. That is straightforward. Buildings burned. Foundations remained. They match the records. The remaining 56 foundations, 56 distinct structural features, in the heart of one of the most thoroughly documented cities in 19th century America, are listed in the survey appendix under the heading Foundations, Origin Not Established. They are given coordinates. They are described in terms of construction material and approximate dimension, and then the appendix ends. There is no follow-up survey. There is no notation of what was done with them. They appear in the record once, in 1872, and then they disappear from the record entirely. 56 foundations, in a city that had been a small trading post 40 years earlier, in a location that, according to every official account, had no substantial permanent settlement before the 19th century. I don't know what those foundations are. I genuinely don't know, and I have spent long enough with this material to understand that I don't know is the most honest thing I can say, because the alternative, picking one explanation and committing to it, would require me to have a certainty about the past that no honest researcher can claim. What I know is that the foundations exist in the record. What I know is that they were found. What I know is that the men who found them wrote them down in the dry, careful language of professional surveyors, coordinates, dimensions, materials, and that the document those men produced is sitting in a research library on the north side of Chicago, accessible to anyone who asks for it. And what I keep thinking about, what I cannot stop thinking about, is Harriet Foss, standing in the tidal mud in February of 1860, looking at something that her employer would later instruct her never to speak of, writing a letter to her sister that said, in the careful, measured language of someone who knew that letters could be read, I understand now why Father always told me the charts were wrong. She was right in 1860 that the charts were wrong. The question is what they were wrong about. And the answer, if there is an answer, is still down there. Beneath the streets of Chicago, beneath the fill of the Back Bay, beneath the embankment, where the Thames once ran wider and shallower and stranger than it does today, under the weight of everything built on top of it, under the decisions of the men who decided that the most efficient thing to do with what they found was to note it once, in a dry appendix, and then cover it over and build something new. The foundations are still there. The coordinates are in the record. And if you go to Chicago, if you walk down into the lower levels of the Riverwalk where, The current street sits above the old grade, and you look at the stone walls that line the channel. You will see, at regular intervals, the outlines of doorways, sealed, faced over with later masonry, but still there in the underlying structure, if you know what to look for. Doors that once opened onto a street that no longer exists, facing a sky that is now a floor.